At court, where every gesture of the king was believed to carry the weight of an entire nation, medical decisions concerning the royal body were treated as sacred acts. Yet the medicine of antiquity and the Middle Ages was far from science. It was a dangerous blend of superstition, tradition, and brutal experimentation. Among the most feared and yet most revered practices were bloodletting and the use of leeches, methods that promised balance but, in reality, paved the way for fragility, suffering, and often the death of kings who believed they were being healed. The idea behind the practice seemed simple, but it was fatally flawed. Royal physicians adhered to the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The balance between these fluids determined the health of the body. Thus, if the king fell ill, the explanation was never infection or disease, but the supposed excess of one humor. And the most obvious, the most treatable? Blood. From this belief, centuries of rulers became victims of their own doctors. Bloodletting was performed in several ways. Sometimes a vein in the king's arm was opened, and the blood allowed to flow until the physician judged it enough. In other cases, leeches were applied directly to the skin, placed on strategic areas. These small creatures would swell with blood, praised as instruments of purification. The court watched in reverent silence, believing each drop carried away sickness. What was rarely spoken aloud was that the king, already weakened by illness, became even more vulnerable after losing alarming quantities of blood. Some accounts describe kings who, subjected to repeated bleedings in short intervals, collapsed before their physicians. But instead of abandoning the practice, the advisors doubled down. If the sovereign worsened, it meant there was still too much blood to purge. If he survived, it was proof of the method's efficacy. The logic was circular, inescapable, and placed entire lives in the hands of misguided beliefs. The use of leeches carried its own horrors. In an age when these creatures were associated with the healing power of nature, physicians believed their bites were gentler than the blade of a scalpel. Kings lay in luxurious beds, while dozens of leeches were placed across their bodies, on their legs, abdomens, even their faces. The immediate result was profound weakness, accompanied by wounds that often became infected. Yet to the court, the sight was reframed as a sacred ritual of purification. There was also a symbolic element. Blood, seen as the source of life and power, carried spiritual weight when spilled. Allowing one's body to be opened and drained was interpreted as an act of humility before the gods, a physical sacrifice to regain strength. Medicine and religion blurred, and royal suffering became a spectacle of devotion. No one dared admit aloud that such practices were slowly killing kings under the guise of healing. Many monarchs succumbed after intense bloodletting sessions. Records describe fevers that might have passed naturally, but instead ended in exsanguination after days of repeated bleedings. Others who survived wounds in battle did not die of injuries, but of the treatments imposed upon them. The cruel irony was clear. Rather than fighting disease, the method accelerated the collapse of the royal body. Court physicians faced a deadly dilemma. To question the practice risked being labeled a traitor, an insult to tradition, or worse, an affront to the king himself. They obeyed instead, opening veins, applying leeches, and hoping the sovereign would endure. The king's body became a battlefield of misguided medicine, and each failure could alter the course of entire kingdoms. This practice did not vanish quickly. Even as evidence mounted that bloodletting harmed more than it healed, centuries passed before it was widely challenged. Tradition weighed heavily, and fear of innovation kept the blade sharp and the leeches plentiful. Kings continued to be drained in gilded beds, their crowns resting only steps away from bodies, weakened by the very cures meant to save them. In the end, the story of these practices reveals more than medical error. It shows the danger of absolute power when combined with superstition. Kings, treated as semi-divine, submitted to rituals that seem absurd today, convinced they were protecting their health and their reign. But in truth, they were delivering their lives into the hands of blades and creatures celebrated as healers. The crown chose blood. And in that choice, repeated over centuries, palaces became chambers of fragility where the life of the sovereign drained, drop by drop, until the throne itself was weaker than the illness it sought to resist. Medicine has always walked a dangerous line between remedy and poison. In ancient and medieval courts, where kings believed their lives were guarded by divine providence, this line blurred into tragedy. Surrounded by alchemists, healers, and physicians who claimed to possess secret knowledge, rulers often consumed concoctions that promised vitality, strength, and long life. But in reality, these elixirs were often mixtures of toxic metals, dangerous herbs, and substances that slowly destroyed the body. What was offered as healing became poison, and what was drunk as salvation became the instrument of decline. The fascination with potions stemmed from a mix of desperation and faith. Kings, unlike ordinary men, carried not only their own survival, but the fate of entire kingdoms on their shoulders. Every cough, every fever, every weakness in their body became a matter of state. It was no surprise, then, that when healers promised miraculous elixirs, rulers drank eagerly. To refuse was to risk death. To accept was to risk something worse: slow poisoning disguised as medicine. One of the most notorious substances used in these potions was mercury. Alchemists praised it as a liquid metal with transformative powers. They believed it could purge illness, rejuvenate the body, and even bring immortality if combined with the right ingredients. Kings, enchanted by these promises, consumed mixtures containing mercury, unaware that it was corroding their organs, damaging their nerves, and leading them into madness. Tremors, hallucinations, and sudden fits of rage were interpreted not as symptoms of poisoning, but as signs of divine trial, until the body collapsed under the weight of the so-called cure. Lead was another silent killer disguised as medicine. It was used in syrups and balms believed to strengthen the body and calm the humors. In reality, it poisoned blood and bones, eroding vitality day by day. Some monarchs who relied heavily on such remedies grew increasingly frail, their bodies wasting away even as their physicians insisted on higher doses. The tragedy was doubled by the fact that the very people trusted to safeguard the royal body were often the ones hastening its decay. Herbal elixirs, too, carried danger. While some herbs truly held medicinal properties, many others were toxic in large amounts. Alchemists seeking powerful effects combined them recklessly, creating brews that triggered hallucinations, violent vomiting, or organ failure. The idea was that suffering proved the medicine's strength. If the king endured the ordeal, it was taken as a sign of divine resilience. If he did not, his death was blamed on the severity of the illness rather than the potion that killed him. There are chilling accounts of kings who insisted on consuming universal antidotes, mixtures of dozens, even hundreds of ingredients prepared in secrecy and consumed daily. These antidotes were meant to protect against poison, a constant fear in the treacherous world of royal courts. But ironically, the antidotes themselves often contained toxic ingredients in slow, cumulative doses. In seeking protection from assassination, rulers unknowingly carried out their own self-destruction. The ritual of drinking these potions was as important as the potion itself. Physicians and alchemists presented their mixtures with ceremony, sometimes accompanied by prayers, invocations, or symbolic gestures. The act of consuming the elixir was staged as both medical treatment and spiritual renewal. To the court, it was proof that the king was cared for by forces beyond ordinary comprehension. Behind the curtain of reverence, however, the royal body was being turned into an experiment, poisoned drop by drop under the guise of sacred science. The trust between king and physician became both the strongest bond and the most dangerous trap. To reject a physician's counsel could be seen as arrogance or even treason, while to accept it meant surrendering one's health to untested remedies. Kings often had little choice. Surrounded by advisors who demanded visible action, they turned to elixirs as proof that their illnesses were being fought. But every sip bound them more tightly to a cycle of decline, as the remedies weakened them further and called for yet more remedies to counteract the effects. The political consequences of these poisonous potions were immense. A weakened king could no longer lead armies, command respect, or project strength to allies and enemies alike. Rumors of his declining health spread through the kingdom, undermining confidence in the throne. Some rulers became reclusive, hiding the ravages of their treatments from public view. Others grew erratic, their minds and tempers unbalanced by the poisons coursing through their blood. In many cases, the fate of entire nations was determined not by battlefield defeats, but by the contents of a royal goblet. What makes these stories particularly haunting is the sincerity with which they unfolded. Physicians did not always act out of malice. and he truly believed in the power of their elixirs. Alchemy was considered a legitimate path to healing, its mixtures framed as the cutting edge of medical knowledge. Kings trusted them because science, religion, and superstition were intertwined, and because the illusion of control was better than facing the terror of helplessness. The tragedy lies not in betrayal, but in misplaced faith. Looking back, these poisonous potions represent one of the darkest chapters of royal medicine. They reveal the fragility of even the most powerful bodies, and the vulnerability of rulers who placed their survival in the hands of men who promised miracles. They also show the danger of unchecked authority in medicine. When no one dares question the methods of a physician or the decisions of a king, mistakes are repeated until they become tradition, and poison becomes cure. The legacy of these practices is still felt today. The very word elixir carries an echo of mystery, a promise of something beyond ordinary healing. But behind the word lies centuries of suffering, when kings, desperate for life, drank death from gilded cups. Their stories remind us that the search for immortality often brings mortality faster, and that the blind pursuit of miracle cures can be far deadlier than the illnesses they claim to treat. In the end, the image that lingers is not one of triumph, but of tragedy. A king seated on his throne, a golden goblet in hand, surrounded by reverent physicians. He drinks, trusting in the promise of strength, while his court watches in silence. The liquid is bitter, but he endures it, believing it is the path to healing. Days later he weakens, his body failing, his mind clouded. The throne trembles not from enemies at the gates, but from the poison delivered by his own cupbearers. That is the hidden story of royal medicine, not protection, but peril. Surgery today conjures images of sterile rooms, gleaming instruments, and skilled hands working with precision. But for kings of the past, surgery was closer to a gamble than a cure. Without anesthesia, without germ theory, and with only the most rudimentary understanding of anatomy, royal physicians wielded their knives in ways that brought more suffering than relief. And when the patient was a king, the consequences were magnified. These barbaric surgeries were performed not only on fragile human bodies, but on the very stability of kingdoms, and far too often they killed more than they saved. The most common operations inflicted upon kings were bloodlettings, by incision, trepanations, amputations, and the draining of abscesses or wounds. Each procedure carried extraordinary risks. In an era before antibiotics, infection was inevitable. In a time before anesthesia, pain was overwhelming. Yet physicians pressed forward, convinced that cutting into the royal body was the only path to healing. Kings, trapped by duty and tradition, submitted themselves to these tortures with little choice. Consider trepanation one of the oldest surgical practices. It involved drilling or cutting a hole into the skull to release pressure or expel evil spirits. For ordinary people, it was already a near-death sentence. For kings, it became a spectacle of desperation. Accounts describe rulers laid on wooden tables, while surgeons used crude chisels and saws to penetrate the skull. Blood poured freely, and the patient screamed in agony as bone fragments were pried loose. Some survived, left with lifelong pain, seizures, or mental decline. Many more never rose from the table, yet the procedure was justified as a medical necessity, a barbaric attempt to heal that more often delivered death. Amputations were equally grim. When a king suffered wounds in battle or developed infections in limbs, the physician's answer was often to cut the offending part away. Without anesthesia, the king had to be restrained by attendants, as saws tore through flesh and bone. The procedure itself was horrifying, but the aftermath was worse. With no understanding of sterilization, wounds became breeding grounds for infection. Gangrene spread, and the king who endured the agony of surgery often perished days later from the complications of the very cure. Even less invasive surgeries could be deadly. The lancing of abscesses or boils was common, done with crude knives in conditions that spread infection faster than they relieved it. A minor infection could spiral into sepsis, leaving a monarch delirious and bedridden. Physicians insisted these procedures were essential, claiming that releasing bad humors would restore balance. In reality, they were carving pathways for death directly into the royal body. What made these surgeries especially tragic was the theater surrounding them. Unlike commoners, kings underwent their operations under the watchful eyes of courtiers, advisors, and family. The king's suffering was not private. It was displayed as proof of endurance, courage, and divine favor. Groans of agony became political statements, reminders to subjects that their ruler was mortal, yet strong enough to endure the knife. Behind the facade of resilience, however, lay the grim reality. The blade of the surgeon often served as executioner. The psychological toll of these procedures was immense. Imagine a ruler who knew that every operation carried the likelihood of death, yet also knew that refusing treatment might be seen as weakness. The king was trapped between the knife and the crown. To endure surgery was to risk death. To refuse it was to risk being remembered as cowardly or negligent. Many rulers chose the knife, and with it, the slow torture of medicine that could not heal. There are also stories of monarchs whose reigns collapsed because of surgery gone wrong. Some kings entered the operating chamber as powerful rulers and left as weakened figures, their bodies broken, their authority diminished. In certain cases, death followed swiftly. The instability that followed a royal death often threw entire kingdoms into chaos, making barbaric surgery not just a personal tragedy, but a political disaster. The cut of a knife could change the fate of nations. The physicians who performed these surgeries were often more akin to butchers than healers. They relied on sharp instruments, heated irons, and rudimentary techniques passed down through tradition rather than scientific study. Yet they enjoyed immense power, for the royal body was their canvas, and the king's life their responsibility. Some were feared, others revered, but nearly all left a trail of suffering in their wake. They could not be challenged easily, for questioning their methods was questioning the authority of both science and the crown. Even when surgery seemed to succeed, the cost was staggering. Survivors endured lives filled with chronic pain, infections, and disability. For a king, whose image of strength was essential to his rule, the visible scars of surgery became symbols of weakness. A ruler who limped, trembled, or suffered visible disfigurement was seen as cursed, unfit, or punished by the divine. In this way, the knife not only cut into flesh, but into reputation, eroding the authority of the throne itself. The irony is almost unbearable. Surgeries were performed in the name of healing, yet they so often accelerated decline. The physician's knife became a weapon, and the operating table became a throne of suffering. Instead of prolonging life, these interventions shortened it. Instead of strengthening kingdoms, they destabilized them. The pursuit of healing turned into a theater of cruelty, where the body of the king was both patient and prisoner. Looking back, these barbaric surgeries serve as a chilling reminder of the dangers of ignorance clothed in authority. Without knowledge of infection, without anesthesia, without the tools of modern medicine, cutting into the human body was an act of brutality disguised as healing. And when the body belonged to a king, the stakes were amplified to the scale of empires. The legacy of these practices is not merely historical curiosity. They warn us of what happens when tradition overrides science, when authority silences doubt, and when desperation drives rulers into the arms of healers, who wield blades instead of reason. The kings who endured these operations became unwilling martyrs to the limits of their age's knowledge. Their suffering carved into history a lesson that remains urgent even today, that the cost of ignorance can be measured in blood, and that the knife of a healer, when guided by false belief, is indistinguishable from the knife of an executioner. In the end, the image that endures is both haunting and symbolic. A king restrained by his own attendants, the surgeon's blade descending, the court holding its breath as the ruler screams in agony. It is the sound not of healing, but of monarchy unraveling. And when the operation ends, whether the king survives or dies, one truth remains: that barbaric surgery was less a cure than a sentence, and that the throne itself was as fragile as the human body upon which it rested. To be the physician of a king was both the highest honor and the most dangerous burden in the realm. These men often hailed as healers, alchemists, or wise scholars, held in their hands not only the life of a single man but the fate of entire kingdoms. Yet history has shown that their advice, their remedies, and their treatments often crossed a thin line between medicine and murder. In many cases, the king's doctor was less a savior and more an executioner, a figure whose counsel, whether through ignorance, ambition, or fear, sealed the fates of monarchs and empires alike. The king's body was no ordinary patient. It was a battlefield of politics, religion, and superstition. Every cough was a matter of state, every fever a potential crisis of succession. This pressure placed immense weight on royal physicians who could not simply admit ignorance. To say "I don't know" was not an option when the survival of a dynasty depended on answers. As a result, these doctors often prescribed with reckless confidence, disguising their uncertainty behind authority. When their advice failed, the king paid the price in blood and suffering. One of the most chilling aspects of this relationship was the physician's absolute influence. Kings trusted their doctors with blind faith, sometimes more than they trusted their generals or advisors. After all, while others managed wars and treaties, the doctor touched the very seat of power, the royal body. This intimacy gave them extraordinary control. Single recommendation could change history. Drain his blood, let him fast, or make him drink this potion. Such words spoken in whispered counsel could determine whether a king lived or died. And far too often, they died. Physicians repeated treatments that were demonstrably harmful, not out of malice, but out of devotion to tradition. The cycle of bleedings, purges, and toxic elixirs was maintained even when kings collapsed under them. To challenge these methods was to challenge centuries of accepted wisdom, and few dared to take that risk. Thus, the king's doctor became the agent of execution, not with the swing of an axe, but with the steady hand of ritualized mistakes. There were also darker motives at play. In some courts, doctors were not neutral healers but pawns in political intrigues. Poisoning was always a shadow over royal medicine. Physicians, with their access to potions and remedies, were perfectly positioned to act as assassins under the cloak of treatment. A bitter-tasting draught or a slow-working elixir could weaken a king beyond recovery, all while appearing as loyal care. Enemies at court whispered in the physician's ear, and suddenly the healer's role blurred fatally with that of the executioner. Even without deliberate poisonings, ambition could corrupt the physician's work. To maintain favor, doctors often told kings what they wanted to hear. If a monarch desired youth, strength, or immortality, the physician promised it, regardless of whether the remedies were safe. When kings demanded cures that did not exist, physicians concocted dangerous mixtures rather than risk losing their positions. The price of ambition was written into the flesh of the king, who endured treatments born more of flattery than science. The doctor's presence at the deathbed also carried symbolic power. In many cases, the physician was the last voice the king heard, the final hand that touched his body. Chroniclers describe scenes where monarchs, pale and broken, looked into the eyes of their healers with desperate trust, only to fade under their care. The line between healer and executioner blurred most vividly here, when the man sworn to protect life presided instead over death, cloaked not in bloodied axes, but in vials, herbs, and whispered instructions. The political fallout of these deaths was immense. When a king died after medical treatment, suspicion always followed. Was the physician incompetent, or was he complicit in treason? Did he serve his patient or his patient's enemies? Some royal doctors were executed themselves, accused of murder when their treatments failed. Others escaped punishment but carried reputations as men of death, feared as much as they were respected. Their proximity to power made them indispensable, but also eternally suspect. The fear of physicians was not limited to the royal court. Ordinary people often regarded them with suspicion, associating their craft with sorcery or forbidden knowledge. Their tools, sharp instruments, bitter powders, strange brews, inspired as much dread as hope. When such figures hovered over the body of a king, the unease spread across the entire kingdom. The monarch's health was tied to the nation's fate, and the sight of a doctor at his side was as likely to inspire fear as reassurance. It is important to note that not all physicians were malicious or incompetent. Many were prisoners of their time, constrained by the limited knowledge of their era. They believed sincerely in the balance of humors, the efficacy of purges, or the divine nature of their remedies. But sincerity did not spare their patients. Good intentions, when armed with false knowledge, proved just as deadly as deliberate harm. And so, the title of executioner clings to them, not because they wielded malice, but because their advice sealed fates with terrifying finality. Looking back, the image of the royal physician is one of paradox. He was trusted more than any other, yet feared as a potential traitor. He was revered as a healer, yet remembered as the agent of death. His words carried the weight of divine judgment, yet his treatments often delivered nothing but pain. The royal physician embodied the fragility of kingship itself, absolute power coupled with absolute vulnerability. The lesson from these stories is clear. Authority without accountability is dangerous, whether in medicine, politics, or power. The physicians of kings operated in a world where their advice could not be questioned, where their failures could not be scrutinized until it was too late. That silence transformed healers into executioners, not by design but by inevitability. And so the haunting image remains. A king lies weakened, surrounded by courtiers, as his physician leans in close. The doctor whispers advice, administers a potion, or orders another bleeding. The court waits. The nation holds its breath. Hours later, the king grows weaker, his crown slipping as life drains away. No axe has fallen, no dagger has struck. The result is the same. The monarch dies, and history turns on the physician's word. Kings have always carried a weight heavier than their crowns, the relentless fear of mortality. Unlike their subjects, who could fade into obscurity, monarchs bore the crushing responsibility of dynasties, armies, and kingdoms. Their death was never their own. It was a collapse that rippled across nations. This fear of the inevitable, of aging decline, and the grave, drove many rulers into a dangerous obsession: the pursuit of immortality. History is littered with their bizarre, often horrifying experiments that promised eternal life, but delivered only suffering and death. The dream of immortality was not unique to kings, but their power and wealth gave them the means to chase it with terrifying intensity. Alchemists were summoned to palaces, their workshops filled with bubbling vials and smoldering furnaces, all in search of the elusive elixir of life. Some promised potions that could halt aging. Others claimed to transmute base materials into substances that granted endless vitality. Kings, desperate to outwit death, drank eagerly. The irony is grim. In their quest to live forever, they poisoned themselves more quickly than any assassin could. Mercury, once considered a mystical metal capable of transformation, became one of the most dangerous tools in this pursuit. Alchemists believed it contained the secret to rejuvenation, and kings consumed it in tonics and pills. But mercury does not heal, it corrodes. Those who ingested it developed trembling limbs, decaying teeth, and shattered minds. The signs of poisoning were interpreted as spiritual trials or temporary setbacks, but the truth was far darker. The elixir of life was killing them slowly, drop by drop. Gold was another obsession. To many rulers, it symbolized incorruptibility, a metal that did not tarnish, that resisted decay. It was eternal. Perhaps its essence could be consumed and shared by mortals. Alchemists devised elaborate powders and drinks infused with gold leaf, assuring kings that they were swallowing eternity itself. In reality, the body could not process such substances. Instead of immortality, the kings received organ damage and agonizing deaths, their bodies weakened by the very material that adorned their crowns. Beyond alchemy, some monarchs turned to stranger experiments. Accounts describe kings bathing in unusual concoctions, oils, herbs, even mixtures of blood and wine, convinced that through the skin they could absorb vitality. Others practiced ritual fasts and extreme diets, believing purification of the body would ward off death. These regimes often left them emaciated, weak, and vulnerable to disease. But desperation silenced doubt. To resist the experiments was to accept mortality, and that was a defeat no king could tolerate. The pursuit of immortality also blurred with religion and mysticism. Some rulers surrounded themselves with priests or prophets who promised divine secrets. Rituals invoking gods, spirits, or cosmic forces became a part of royal medical practice. These ceremonies, often involving chanting, burning incense, and symbolic sacrifices, created the illusion of protection against death, yet no incantation could halt the decay of the human body. The kings who submitted to such rites did not ascend into eternity. They descended into delusion, mistaking superstition for salvation. But perhaps the most disturbing experiments were those performed on others in the king's quest to save himself. Chroniclers speak of monarchs who ordered their physicians to test elixirs on servants, prisoners, or even loyal courtiers before consuming them. These human trials revealed the lethality of many mixtures, but rather than abandon the quest, rulers pressed forward, convinced that refinement would eventually yield the true elixir of life. The cost of these experiments was written in countless unnamed deaths, victims sacrificed on the altar of royal fear. The obsession with immortality had devastating political consequences. A king weakened by bizarre treatments could not lead armies or command respect. His erratic behavior, fueled by poisons and delusions, eroded trust among allies and subjects. Rumors spread quickly through kingdoms, whispers that the ruler had gone mad, that he was cursed, that divine wrath had fallen upon him for his arrogance. In this way, the quest for eternal life often hastened the decline of empires as weakened rulers dragged their thrones down with them. The paradox is stark. Kings who held absolute power were the most powerless before death. Their crowns could not shield them from time, their armies could not battle the grave, their wealth could not purchase eternity. In their desperation, they placed their faith in alchemists, charlatans, and dangerous experiments. The throne became not a symbol of stability, but a laboratory of horror, where every potion was a gamble and every experiment a reminder of mortality. And yet this obsession speaks to something profoundly human. Who among us has not wished to escape the shadow of death? For kings, this desire was magnified 1,000-fold by the weight of their crowns. Their fear of mortality is a mirror, reflecting our own, but distorted by the extremes of power. Where we dream, they acted. Where we hesitate, they consumed. And in doing so, they revealed the cost of trying to defy the natural order. The legacy of these bizarre experiments is cautionary. They remind us that the pursuit of immortality is not noble, but destructive. The kings who sought to live forever often died sooner, their bodies ruined by poisons, their minds shattered by delusion. Their reigns remembered not for triumphs, but for madness. Stories linger as warnings that eternity cannot be bottled, swallowed, or forged in the furnaces of alchemy. In the end, the image is haunting. A king seated at a golden table, an alchemist presenting a shimmering vial. The monarch lifts it with trembling hands, eyes filled with both fear and hope. He drinks, believing he has stolen time itself. Hours, days, or months later, his body convulses, his mind falters, his kingdom crumbles. The elixir of life was never life at all. It was the poison of hubris, the price of believing that even kings could conquer death. History often remembers kings for their victories in war, their grand palaces, or their ruthless decrees. Yet hidden beneath the marble halls and jeweled crowns lies another far darker story. The legacy of medicine gone wrong. For centuries, the greatest thrones of the world doubled as deathbeds, where flawed treatments, toxic remedies, and misguided physicians transformed rulers into victims of their own cures. In the end, the mistakes of royal medicine did not merely kill kings, they destabilized kingdoms, turned dynasties into ruins, and etched into history a chilling reminder that power cannot protect against ignorance. The legacy of these errors begins with the throne itself. Kings were not simply men. They were symbols of divine order, guardians of nations. When illness struck them, it was seen not as an ordinary event, but as a cosmic crisis. The royal body was more than flesh and bone. It was a living embodiment of the realm. Thus, every treatment, no matter how bizarre, carried monumental weight. When a physician reached for a blade, a vial, or a leech, the fate of an empire trembled. Sanguine rituals of bloodletting drained monarchs into weakness, sold as cures but functioning as slow executions. Poisonous potions disguised as elixirs of health corroded their bodies from within. Barbaric surgeries performed with crude tools and without understanding left rulers scarred, crippled, or dead on the table. Physicians whispered advice that kings could not question, advice that often signed their death warrants. And perhaps most tragically, rulers themselves demanded experiments to cheat death, consuming mercury, swallowing gold, and embracing the false promises of alchemy until their thrones became laboratories of ruin. Each of these practices, carried out with solemn ritual, left behind a trail of corpses crowned in jewels. The cost of these medical errors was never confined to the king alone. A monarch's decline rippled outward, shaking the stability of the entire kingdom. Armies hesitated under weakened leadership. Courts fractured as factions positioned themselves for succession. Rivals sensed vulnerability and struck. In some cases, the poor decisions of royal medicine reshaped the political map more dramatically than any battle could. A fever untreated, a wound mishandled, a potion misprescribed. These were not private tragedies, but public catastrophes. Thrones became tombs, and kingdoms followed their kings into chaos. And yet, for centuries, the cycle repeated. Why? Because authority and superstition silenced doubt. Physicians clung to ancient theories about humors and balance, unwilling to admit ignorance. Alchemists promised miracles, and rulers, desperate for immortality, believed them. To question tradition was to risk punishment. To defy the king's will was to invite ruin. Thus, dangerous practices persisted, passed from one generation to the next, carving error into ritual and ignorance into dogma. The figure of the royal physician embodies this legacy perfectly. Cloaked in robes of authority, he stood at the bedside with a mixture of power and fear. His words carried more weight than generals or priests, for he spoke directly to the frailty of the king's body. Yet behind his confidence often lay guesswork, superstition, or political manipulation. Some truly believed in their methods. Others saw opportunity to gain power or settle scores. In either case, the result was the same. The doctor's hand became the executioner's hand, not through the swing of an axe, but through a prescription, a cut, a drop of poison. The kings, for their part, were not. Power has always promised protection. Behind castle walls, surrounded by armies, crowned in gold, kings believed themselves shielded from the vulnerabilities of ordinary men. And yet, when we strip away the armor and the robes, their bodies told another story. Fragile, fallible, and often destroyed not by enemies in battle, but by the very cures meant to preserve them. The saga of royal medicine is not one of healing. It is a chilling reminder that ignorance, superstition, and unchecked authority can turn the throne into nothing more than a gilded coffin. Across centuries, we have seen kings drained of life through endless bloodletting, convinced that their strength flowed from an imagined balance of humors. We have watched them sip glittering potions laced with mercury and lead, promised immortality, but gifted only madness and decay. We have heard the screams of rulers bound to wooden tables, their skulls drilled and their limbs severed in surgeries more akin to torture than science. And we have seen their physicians, cloaked in authority, whisper counsel that sealed destinies, not through malice alone, but through the arrogance of false knowledge. Even worse, we have witnessed the kings themselves, fueling their own destruction, obsessed with defying mortality. They bathed in strange concoctions, swallowed metals, and trusted alchemists who promised eternity in a vial. These were not simply medical errors. They were acts of desperation, revealing the truth that even those who ruled nations could not rule over death. The irony is as sharp as any surgeon's knife. In their quest to prolong their lives, kings often hastened their ends. The consequences of these choices extended far beyond the royal body. Every failed treatment, every weakened ruler, every death brought by medicine altered the course of history. Wars were lost because a king could not rise from his sick bed. Dynasties crumbled because an heir never lived to inherit the crown. Empires trembled not under the strike of foreign armies, but under the steady drip of poisonous elixirs or the deep cuts of a physician's blade. The errors of royal medicine were not private tragedies. They were catastrophes that reshaped nations. And still, for centuries, the cycle continued.
Oh, why?
Because tradition blinded reason.
Oh.
The authority of physicians was rarely challenged, their failures dismissed as fate, their successes exaggerated into legend. Kings, terrified of appearing weak, submitted again and again to rituals that killed their predecessors. To question a doctor's advice was to question the weight of history itself, and so the mistakes repeated. Ignorance immortalized in ritual, superstition enshrined as cure. This is the haunting legacy of royal medicine. The throne, with all its splendor, became a stage for suffering. Palaces that echoed with laughter and music also echoed with groans of agony and the hiss of boiling concoctions. Crowns glittered above faces pale with poison, and royal beds became operating tables where life slipped away in the name of healing. These kings did not die solely from disease. They were undone by the very hands sworn to save them. Yet within this legacy lies a lesson far larger than the fate of monarchs. It is a warning about the dangers of authority without accountability, of superstition masquerading as science, and of desperation clouding judgment. Kings were not the only victims. they were simply the most visible. Their suffering exposes a truth that still resonates today: that ignorance in medicine is as deadly as the diseases it claims to cure, and that blind trust in authority, no matter how noble the title, can lead directly to ruin. The image that remains is both powerful and tragic. A ruler sits in a gilded chamber, surrounded by physicians who speak with confidence and certainty. A blade is drawn, a potion poured, a ritual begun. The king consents, believing that he is protecting not just his life, but the life of his kingdom. Hours or days later, he collapses, weaker than before, his crown heavy upon his failing body. The throne, once a symbol of glory, becomes a tomb, and history repeats the pattern again and again. Blood drained, poison swallowed, bones cut, promises made, lives lost, thrones emptied, kingdoms fractured. The story of royal medicine is not about healing, it is about hubris. It is about the arrogance of men who believed they could outwit death, and the folly of trusting cures that were worse than the diseases themselves. It is about the physicians who played executioners, and the kings who became martyrs to superstition. It is about the fragility of power, exposed not by enemies at the gates, but by ignorance at the bedside. In the end, what survives is not the elixirs, the instruments, or the rituals. They are gone, discredited, abandoned in the march of science. What remains is the lesson: that knowledge saves, but false knowledge destroys. That power protects no one from the laws of nature. And that the greatest danger is not always the illness itself, but the cure we choose to believe in. So as we close this chapter, remember this: the worst medical decisions kings ever made were not simply errors of the past. They are warnings etched in blood and poison, reminding us that even the mightiest can fall victim to ignorance. A crown cannot shield the body, a throne cannot bribe death. And when superstition masquerades as science, the cure is always deadlier than the disease. The legacy of these kings is written not in triumph, but in tragedy. Their palaces became tombs, physicians became executioners, and their crowns, symbols of immortality, became relics resting upon skulls, hollowed by the very treatments meant to preserve them. That is the true horror of royal medicine: the reminder that the pursuit of power and the pursuit of immortality are both doomed to fail, and that sometimes the deadliest enemy sits not across the battlefield, but at the king's bedside, holding a cup, a blade, or a vial.
History hides its darkest truths in plain sight. If you want to uncover the next forbidden secret, hit like and subscribe right now.